to the debate. If you hand a teenager today a tangled cassette tape and a wooden pencil, they will probably look at you like you are handing them an alien artifact.
Right. Completely baffled.
Exactly. For older generations, the pencil is the obvious, immediate tool to fix the tape. You stick it in the reel, you wind it up. It is an analog solution to an analog problem. But today, when confronted with a problem, younger generations do not reach for a physical tool. They reach for an algorithm. They search for video or ask an AI why those two objects even go together.
Which is a fundamental shift in behavior.
It is. So are we witnessing an evolutionary leap in how human beings think, or are we slowly outsourcing our brains to machines? Today, we are exploring a profoundly heavy question derived from the literature.
That's looking specifically at the analytical text. Is AI making us dumber?
Right. The core of our inquiry is this. Is the integration of artificial intelligence into our daily lives a vital tool for cognitive optimization, or does it represent the systemic decay of our cognitive autonomy? I take the former view.
And I naturally take the latter.
I argue that AI is fundamentally a mechanism that magnifies human baseline capability. By freeing the mind from tedious analog labor, it allows us to ascend to higher-order synthesis.
And I come at it from a very different structural angle. That transition from the pencil and the cassette to immediate algorithmic answers is not just, an optimization of labor. The generational outsourcing of the brain to generative AI represents a perilous epistemological shift.
Perilous?
Absolutely perilous. We are not merely changing our tools. We are fundamentally altering the architecture of human thought. Relying on an algorithm to do your reasoning risks an existential decay in our critical autonomy.
Well, I see why you think that, but I have to challenge this idea of an epistemological shift as an inherently negative thing. You are framing this shift as a decay, but I view the transition from analog learning to digital and now AI integration as a natural evolutionary enhancement.
How is bypassing the act of thinking an enhancement?
Because it isn't bypassing thought, it is reallocating it. Look at Generation X. They grew up in an entirely analog world. Completing a research project required hours of physical reading, manually organizing preliminary research from physical encyclopedias, writing out notes on index cards, and, constructing arguments from scratch.
Right. They had to build the cognitive framework themselves.
But it was highly laborious. AI offloads the rote mechanics of information gathering. It frees the human brain for synthesis. So when Generation Alpha, who are essentially AI natives, engage in prompt engineering, we shouldn't view it as a lack of thinking.
I disagree entirely.
Let me just finish the thought. Prompt engineering is a native, highly efficient problem-solving talent. It is a new logical framework. We are just judging it by an outdated analog standard.
I am sorry, but I just don't buy that prompt engineering is a substitute for structural reasoning. You're talking about Gen X, right? What sociologists call digital immigrants?
Yes.
They learned technology as an addition to an already established way of thinking. They developed strong habits of structured thinking, information synthesis, and critical evaluation because they had to learn to reason without digital assistance.
Sure. The analog foundation was there.
Exactly. The cognitive pathways were already built. Now, contrast that with Generation Alpha. They are growing up immersed in algorithmic feeds, where information is completely fragmented. They might use an AI tutor before they even learn to read independently.
Which provides personalized, immediate feedback.
But at what cognitive cost? Rather than elevating their thinking, this reliance on immediate, bite-sized answers creates an absolute fragmentation in how information is consumed. Critical thinking requires the very friction that AI eliminates.
Wait, but is it? I have to push back there. Are we just romanticizing the struggle?
It is not romanticizing. It is neurology.
Hear me out. I remember spending hours in a library card catalog, trying to find the right Dewey Decimal number, walking the stacks, and then realizing the book was checked out. That wasn't learning. That was just tedious physical labor and inefficiency.
But you are...
Does the physical friction of navigating a card catalog inherently produce a superior intellect, or does it merely romanticize inefficiency?
You are equating the manual labor of retrieving a physical book with the intellectual act of synthesizing information. And those are two different mechanisms entirely. The friction I am talking about is cognitive friction, not physical.
Okay, explain the distinction you're making there.
Look at the sociological data tracking this shift in the text. Studies on attention spans in the digital age, like the Microsoft Canada 2015 report, show a measurable decline in our ability to sustain focus on long-form complex information.
Well, attention adapts to the medium.
Furthermore, psychological research from the University of Virginia indicates that younger generations increasingly rely on external information sources rather than internal memory. Let's look at the actual mechanics of learning. Say a student uses AI to explain photosynthesis.
Okay.
The algorithm produces a perfect, effortless summary in 3 bullet points.
Which is incredibly efficient. They get the answer instantly.
Yes, they get the answer, but what happens in the brain? In order for information to move from short-term working memory into long-term consolidation, the brain requires cognitive load.
Right, there has to be some encoding process.
Exactly. It requires the friction of reading a dense text, filtering out the irrelevant parts, identifying the core concepts, and physically or mentally organizing them. That effort is what builds synaptic connections.
I see the argument.
Because the student bypassed that friction and just read the perfect AI summary, they retain nothing. The output looks like learning on the screen, but the underlying neurological process is the exact opposite of it. They connect nothing to their existing foundation of knowledge.
That is an interesting point regarding the mechanics of memory retention. If you don't struggle with the text, the neural pathways don't form as robustly. I can see that. However, I would frame the context differently.
How so?
For Generation Alpha, prompt engineering is an environment, not just an isolated tool. Knowing what keywords to enter, how to structure a complex prompt, and how to iterate on an AI's response requires a deep understanding of logic and context.
But it is outsourced logic.
It is a different kind of reasoning. Why should we penalize them for operating seamlessly in an environment where algorithmic retrieval is the baseline?
But even if prompt engineering is a new form of logic, it is an entirely hollow form of reasoning if the user lacks the capacity for independent verification.
Hollow in what sense?
Let me give you an analogy from the material. When you use a GPS to navigate a new city every single day, you arrive at your destination quickly and efficiently, but you lose your innate sense of direction. You never build a mental map of the city.
Because you don't need to. The tool does it.
Exactly. AI is a cognitive GPS. It gets you to the answer faster, but you no longer know the streets of your own mind. And this brings us to the severe, practical consequences of trusting that information without the foundational knowledge to verify it.
Moving from the classroom to the professional sphere.
Yes, we are not just talking about middle schoolers learning photosynthesis anymore. We are talking about the ethical outsourcing of reality.
Are you referring to the professional failures we have seen recently? The algorithmic dependency in high-stakes fields that the text outlines?
Exactly. Look at the real-world case studies provided in the analysis. We have lawyers submitting legal briefs to federal courts containing AI-generated citations for cases that literally never existed.
A notorious example, yes.
We have travelers relying on AI chatbots for visa advice only to arrive at an airport and find out the legal requirements were entirely fabricated. We have researchers generating fake academic references.
Which are glaring errors, absolutely.
This isn't just a technological glitch or a funny mistake. When a lawyer allows an algorithm to decide what constitutes legal precedent, humanity is systemically surrendering its responsibility for independent judgment. The professional didn't have the mental map of their own field to realize the GPS was driving them into a lake.
I hear you. But I think you are blaming the technology for human laziness. You are conflating user incompetence with technological determinism.
I don't think it is just laziness. It is a structural reliance.
Let's go back to an old foundational software engineering principle mentioned in our source material. Garbage in, garbage out. AI does not automatically make people dumber. It magnifies existing capabilities.
Magnifies them in both directions, I would argue.
Right. Think about it. Individuals with strong domain knowledge, people who already have that mental map, use advanced models like Claude or Gemini to challenge their own assumptions, iterate on complex problems, and improve their outputs dramatically.
Yes, for the experts, it is a multiplier.
Exactly. AI didn't create human carelessness. It merely made the lack of critical thinking more visible and, well, exponentially more efficient.
It certainly made it more visible.
Right. So we cannot blame the algorithm for the user's abdication of responsibility. If a lawyer submits a hallucinated citation to a judge, that is a spectacular failure of the lawyer's professional rigor. It is not a systemic failure of the technology itself.
But the technology enables it at an unprecedented scale.
The AI is doing exactly what it was programmed to do: predict the next most likely word in a sequence. The human failed to apply judgment.
That is a compelling argument on an individual level. Yes, it magnifies existing capabilities. The knowledgeable become more effective, and the careless become more efficiently wrong.
Precisely.
But let's look at the macrostructural implications of this. What happens when the majority of a population falls into the latter category? What happens when the generation that never built the mental map becomes the professional class?
You are suggesting a systemic tipping point.
I am. If individuals no longer possess the foundational knowledge to recognize AI mistakes because they have grown up bypassing the friction required to build that foundation, society stops creating new knowledge.
We just recycle the old.
Exactly. We begin to rely entirely on recombined, fragmented summaries of past human thought. This mass cognitive outsourcing threatens the very foundation of collective decision-making and democratic consensus.
That is a very grim extrapolation.
But a necessary one. If the populace loses its capacity to determine what is objectively true and delegates the arbitration of truth to an engagement-driven algorithm, how does a democratic society function? We lose cognitive agency at a societal scale.
I understand the gravity of that concern, but I disagree that we are hurtling toward a total collapse of objective truth. Human systems adapt to correct these deficiencies.
Adapt how? We are doubling down on the dependency.
Well, society's demand for the productivity benefits of AI is irreversible, yes. But the market also demands accuracy. We are already seeing a fascinating contradiction play out in the corporate world that addresses this.
You mean the hiring discrepancies?
Yes, employers are actively rejecting applicants whose resumes or cover letters appear entirely AI-generated. They use AI detectors to filter them out. Yet, once hired, those same employers demand the massive productivity increases that AI-driven workflows provide.
That's incredibly hypocritical of the market, though.
It is a contradiction, absolutely. Demanding AI efficiency but requiring human authenticity forces a market correction. It means we cannot retreat from the technology, but we have to resolve the tension by elevating human standards.
I am not sure the market is successfully elevating those standards yet.
The market will punish the lawyer who hallucinates citations and reward the lawyer who uses AI to perfectly synthesize valid precedent. We have to teach people where the line is between optimization and abdication.
But who is drawing that line? Right now, almost no one is. AI companies just slap a disclaimer at the bottom of the screen warning that the system may make mistakes.
A legal liability shield.
Exactly. That warning exists because these models operate at a scale accessing and recombining human-generated content at speeds we simply can't match. But if our understanding of the world becomes increasingly shallow, if our reading habits mutate into absolute fragmentation, the quality of our interaction with AI deteriorates.
Because we lack the rigor to prompt it correctly.
Right. My argument for structural retreat isn't about smashing the servers and going back to the cassette tape. It is about recognizing that if we stop synthesizing ideas ourselves, we lose the cognitive agency required to govern ourselves.
We become dependent on the black box.
We become a society of prompters, entirely reliant on a black box to tell us what is real, what is legal, and what is true.
I acknowledge the risk of mass algorithmic dependency. It is a legitimate concern. If we only consume fragmented summaries, we definitely risk losing the muscle memory for deep synthesis.
We are already seeing it happen.
But let us bring this existential, philosophical debate back down to the physical, geopolitical realities of the current global AI race. Because for all our worry about AI taking over our cognitive processes, we are forgetting the ultimate bottleneck: physical reality.
You mean the hardware constraints?
Exactly. Look at the geopolitical landscape right now, as detailed in the text. The competition surrounding AI is intensely focused on physical things: silicon chips, massive data centers, cooling systems, and electrical grid capacity.
Yes, the physical footprint is massive.
It involves high-stakes maneuvering between the United States, China, Europe, and Taiwan. The technology itself might feel like an infinite, frictionless cloud, but the critical execution of history remains a strictly human monopoly.
On that specific point, we are in absolute intellectual convergence.
I thought we might be.
You can look at the recent expansion of NVIDIA's headquarters in Taiwan. It perfectly illustrates this physical bottleneck. As much as we theorize about algorithmic autonomy and systems thinking for themselves, the physical infrastructure of the entire AI economy is bound by incredibly rigid human constraints.
Algorithms didn't negotiate that deal.
Exactly. That massive geopolitical maneuver in the semiconductor space was never closed by AI. It relied on high-level human negotiation, diplomatic compromise, political leverage, leadership, and human judgment.
Right. Algorithms can process the regional data, they can optimize the supply chain models, and they can even generate the first drafts of the legal contracts, which, again, hopefully a competent lawyer verified.
Right. Let's hope so.
But at the end of the day, humans sit at a table, look each other in the eye, and make decisions that dictate the future.
They do. Governments must negotiate tax incentives. Corporations must negotiate incredibly complex global supply chains. Investors evaluate risk based on human intuition as much as data. And engineers have to navigate the physical laws of thermodynamics just to keep these data centers from melting.
It is deeply physical.
And that is perhaps the most vital reminder of the AI era. The technology is advancing exponentially, but the critical execution of history remains our burden.
AI can assist our thinking, but it cannot replace the need to take action.
Exactly. It cannot replace the need to think, nor the need to take responsibility for that thinking. The urgent question is not how much AI can do for us, but whether we will still possess the capacity to think independently when the stakes are at their highest.
That is the core tension.
What makes the future unsettling isn't just the rise of intelligent machines. It is the possibility that while we are busy building these machines, we gradually stop exercising our own intellect. We need to remember that the cassette tape and the pencil weren't just obsolete technology. They were a monument to the cognitive friction that taught us how to solve problems with our own two hands. We would do well not to lose that grip.
We must maintain that human counterweight. The baseline of human judgment simply cannot be outsourced.
Whether you side with technological evolution or structural retreat, this inquiry demands deeper synthesis.
For the complete written analysis, access the full essay on our primary blogger site.
For a concise, high-impact visual breakdown, watch our 10-minute video review on YouTube.
All entry points are systematically pinned in the session notes below.